Inimitable sound of today's Jazz Library subject, the saxophonist Stan.Getz. And joining me to talk about Stan.Getz and his music is his biographer, Dave Kelly, the author of a book called Nobody Else But Me, Stan.Getz's Story. Dave, just those few bars were enough to establish the thing that I suppose all of us think of with Stan, which is the sound.
Yes, the sound. Everybody says the sound. But actually, if you listen to Stan's music over the course of his playing life, the sound changes almost by the year. From the beginning to the end, it's very, very different. At the same time, it's always recognisably him, and therein lies the paradox. I mean, how does it change so much and still be recognisably Stan?
Well, I know that we've all got our own the first time I heard Stan.Getz's story, but for me it was actually hearing him on stage in Carnegie Hall and coming out playing without any amplification, and, as he often did in those days, walking from the back of the stage whilst playing, and that extraordinary sound filling a beautiful concert hall.
Yes, he seemed to carry his own acoustics around with him. I mean, wherever he was, it sounded the same. Most people, you know, if they're playing in an echoey place or a dull place, it would sound different. But he seemed to carry this sort of acoustic aura about with him, so that wherever he was, it sounded exactly right.
Well, going back to start with to the beginning, or not quite the beginning, but the most famous early phase of his career, which is playing in the Woody Herman Orchestra, and we could hardly do worse than start with the track Four Brothers. This was the great Reed section of the 1947 Woody Herman Band. Let's just talk a little about that band, because it was quite unusual to have a band with so many tenor saxophones in it.
Yes, because the normal big band is 2 altos, 2 tenors and baritone, whereas the Herman, the second herd as it was called, was 1 alto, 3 tenors and baritone. And very often the alto, who was there for sort of straight purposes, was dropped out, so it was 4 tenors and baritone. And when you have a tenor saxophone playing in the range that an alto saxophone normally plays in, it doesn't sound the same.
What's the order of the soloists?
The order of the soloists is Zoot Sims, then Serge Charloff on baritone, then Herbie Stewart on tenor, and then finally Stan.Getz on tenor.
Woody Herman Orchestra in December 1947 with Four Brothers, written by Jimmy Giuffre and included on a double album on Columbia of this great Woody Herman band of the late 40s, and it's very definitely featured on there. Details on the Jazz Library website, the address to come later in the programme. Well, Dave, even in that tiny chorus of Stan at the end of the sort of sequence of players in the Four Brothers band, you could sense the very different tone that Stan had. Now, I have to say that in terms of Jazz Library, he causes more controversy than perhaps any other figure. We had Bud Shank, the late Bud Shank, talking on the programme just a few months ago and saying that for him, Stan.Getz was the most technically perfect saxophonist ever. Full stop, no questions, no argument. We've had other people writing, posting on the message board and saying, in their opinion, Stan.Getz wasn't an original person. He was simply an extraordinarily good editor and assembler of other people's ideas. Where do you stand on this?
Very often when people want to praise a jazz musician, they say, he was revolutionary and he changed the face of jazz. That's what they say, don't they? But in fact, the thing about Stan is he didn't change the face of anything. He just was Stan.Getz. His first debt was to Lester Young, but you would never confuse Stan.Getz with Lester Young. You wouldn't confuse him, partly because he doesn't actually sound very much like Lester Young. What he does have is a similar, rather contained sound. Instead of being all out up front like Coleman Hawkins, it's a contained sound. And he was a great admirer of Lester Young, but he doesn't sound like Lester Young because he uses a lot of phraseology which Lester Young would never have used because it derives from bebop. That's the first thing. The second thing, his sound kept changing as his thoughts changed. Coleman Hawkins, for instance, used the same sound but gradually elaborated harmonically and all that kind of thing. But Stan actually changed the sound rather than changing the notes. He never played particularly odd notes, but his voice changed, put it like that.
Well, we're going to hear an example of that now from a year on from the previous track recorded on, I think, the very end of December 1948. This piece by Ralph Burns was part of a cycle, and the section that featured Stan was called Early Autumn. To me, this is almost impressionistic playing. It's a very different type of thought process from what we heard in Four Brothers.
It floats, doesn't it? The sound floats, is how I think of it.
Early Autumn, featuring the subject of today's Jazz Library, Stan.Getz on tenor saxophone, from the Woody Herman album, Keeper of the Flame, on the Capitol label. That was recorded in December 1948, contrary, I should say, to the information given on the liner notes. Dave and I have done some discographical digging, and I think we can say that with some certainty. Let's move on to the moment that Stan really launched his own career in his own right, because I suspect, Dave, that he moved from that very big band, comfortable environment. There are lots of stories about he quite liked being in a big band. He liked the camaraderie, liked the narcotic stimulation of that particular orchestra as well. But he, for the rest of his life, tended to work with piano, bass, drums accompaniment from then on, and that's exactly what he went on to do. Where are we going next?
Well, he comes out of the Woody Herman band. I think it had its day, actually. I mean, a lot of them were leaving at the time. And he set up as a soloist, working with rhythm sections. He didn't actually have a band of his own. I mean, the following for modern jazz in those days was really tiny. But if anybody could say that there was a hit record coming out of that scene, it was one by Stan.Getz, which was called Long Island Sound. And it's the same tone, the same sound. It's less than a year later than Early Autumn, and it's the same sound, but it's speaking for itself rather than a part of an ensemble.
Long Island Sound, recorded in June 1949 by Stan.Getz on tenor with Al Haig piano, Gene Ramey bass and Stan Levy drums. And we've taken that from the chronological classics edition of Stan.Getz, the 1946-49 volume. One difficulty with this series, as I keep saying here on Jazz Library, is these are not readily available, but there are plenty around in the second-hand market, and I do suggest chasing that one down because it's a very good introduction to Stan's work in his own right from the mid to the late 40s. We're going to move on, still in that same context of small groups, Dave, but to a partnership that certainly had its ups and downs. We'll probably talk more about Stan's relationships with individual musicians, but his relationship, as you explain in your book, with Jimmy Rainey, the guitarist, was a little bit on and off, wasn't it, over a period of time?
With Jimmy Rainey, it was on and off because Jimmy Rainey didn't like the general druggy atmosphere that Stan tended to carry around with him. And that was all, really. I mean, they were actually made for each other. The sound of the tenor saxophone and the sound of the electric guitar are beautifully matched. They just go well together. And the first band, the real band that Stan had, was this one that's coming up, which with Jimmy Rainey as a sort of front-line partner on guitar rather than in the rhythm section, and Al Haig, who I think was at the time his favourite pianist. One thing that nobody ever said about Stan.Getz was that he wasn't a good band leader, because he was. I mean, he was a difficult person and he had difficult personal relationships with people. But when it came to leading a band, they all said that he was absolutely on the button all the time. He knew exactly what he wanted. He said what he wanted. He managed to grasp the essence of someone else's playing and put them in the context where they sounded at their best. And every single person that ever talks about playing with Stan Getz, apart from saying that he could be extremely difficult as a person, said he knew how to run a band, and he also knew how to choose a band.
Thinking just a little about this band, this is different from the previous recordings in that this is live at George Wean's Storyville Club in Boston in October 1951. The live setting seems to suit him there, doesn't it? He plays off the audience.
He does, and although there are sort of loose bits in the ensemble playing, he is an absolutely immaculate tenor player himself. He never plays a dodgy note or not even a slurred thing where it's supposed to be something else. It's absolutely minuscule correctness in his playing all the time. That's why people say he's the best saxophone player ever.
The Song Is You, written by Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein II, and recorded by Stan Getz with his quintet at the Storyville in Boston in October 1951. Stan Getz on tenor with Al Haig piano, Jimmy Rainey guitar, Teddy Kotick bass, and Tiny Khan drums. And that's on a set called The Complete Roost Sessions on the Jazz Factory label. But Dave, we're going to move to a slightly unusual period in Stan's life, just a year on from that, 52, when he was in a studio orchestra for a while and actually recorded a similar-sized group in very similar partnership with a frontline partner, this time the guitarist Johnny Smith. And I gather this because they were both working in a studio orchestra.
Yeah, I think they were both with the NBC studio band for radio and television. Everybody was surprised that Getz did this, but he said, well, it's an interesting job and you've always got something different each day to do. And it kept him interested for a while, and then he got fed up with it because he was getting busy as a soloist and it was just taking up too much time. But he did form a friendship with Johnny Smith, who was an all-round guitar player. I mean, Johnny Smith was one of those guys. He could play country, he could play this, he could play that, Everybody said Johnny Smith is the guitar player from the technical point of view. And they evolved this way of playing ballads where Johnny Smith would play the melody, full chorded melody, and Stan would sort of play little phrases in between. And interestingly enough, it was a biggish hit. Insofar as jazz instrumentals ever are a hit, it was quite a biggish hit in the States for late night radio and things like that. And it points to one thing that I think jazz people don't think enough about, in that is when jazz musicians become popular, they become popular not because of their personalities, but because what they play sounds nice. And the thing about almost all the things of Stan's that became very popular was that they were melodic and pleasantly voiced.
Well, this, as you said, became a minor hit. It's Moonlight in Vermont, and it's from the album The Chronological Stan.Getz on the Classics label. Moonlight in Vermont by Stan.Getz with the Johnny Smith Quintet, and that's on the chronological Johnny Smith 1951 to 52 on the Classics label. And a little bit of internet searching shows that you can still get copies of that album, recorded in March 1952. This is Jazz Library with me, Alan Shipton, and my guest, Dave Kelly, the biographer of Stan.Getz, discussing Stan's musical legacy. And we're going to move from that to an absolutely startling example of just how technically assured and briskly fingered Stan.Getz could be, with really an old warhorse from the 1930s. Louis Armstrong recorded Shine with his big band back in 1931 or 32, and yet Stan could take this 25 years later and make it sound completely his own.
Stan started his professional career with Jack Teagarden, and he always said playing with a Dixieland band was the best way to start your career, because you learn things that you don't learn if you start further along the line of complication. he enjoyed playing Dixieland tunes. Right throughout his career, he would pick out an unlikely tune, like Shine, for instance. He did Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye on one occasion. He does all sorts of funny things. So he took Shine. He probably decided to do it on the spur of the moment in the studio. And it turned out to be, by any standards, a tour de force. Simply as a piece of saxophone playing, it's almost impossible, from the introduction onwards. But on top of that, the amount of sheer mental agility it takes to put all those things together and make them work, and to do it at that length, 18 choruses without, as they say, hesitation or repetition. I mean, he just went right through the card. I can't imagine you could do anything more with Shine by the time you'd finished with that, at that tempo, and not a single stumble anywhere. It is a most amazing performance.
Well, we'll try and squeeze as many of those choruses in. We may have to cut the track a little short because it does run at its full extent to some 9 minutes. But here is as much as we can squeeze into the programme of Shine. Getz in pyrotechnic form from the album West Coast Jazz on Verve, jointly led by Stan Getz and the drummer Shelley Mann. The full lineup: Stan Getz tenor, Conti Candoli getting a brief look in there on trumpet, Leroy Vinegar bass, Lou Levy piano and Shelley Mann drums, recorded in 1955. We're going to stick with that band in 1956 with a slight change in the drum chair. Shelley Mann leaves the drum chair and is replaced by Stan Levy, who we heard earlier on. Another ballad this time, and I love the way that Stan, who was a very precise and rhythmic bebop drummer, also had this ability, almost like Roy Haynes, to shade an ensemble in a very impressionistic way. This is a ballad called You're Blasé, and it seems to me the perfect balance between an extremely supportive rhythm section and Stan at his most lyrical.
Yes, and the thing to notice, if you think back to Early Autumn, is how the sound has changed. For one thing, when you hear Early Autumn, the sound is thin, it's beautiful, it's airy and thin, but it's so light that it's almost not there. Whereas by the time you get to Your Blasé in the mid-50s, there's much more weight in the sound, there's air around it, which you couldn't even hear any air in the other one at all. It was as though it was made of nothing. And there's vibrato. All of a sudden there's vibrato. You never heard vibrato of Stan Getz before, and then suddenly it appears. And from there on, for the rest of his life, the vibrato became a constant presence in his playing, and not only that, but it became stronger as time went on. But this Your Blasé is a beautiful little performance. It is lyrical, it's lovely. It's the song, he plays the song, and everything that he adds to it merely makes the song sound better.
You're Blasé from the album The Steamer, on Verve by the Stan.Getz Quartet. Stan with Lou Levy piano, Leroy Vinegar bass and Stan Levy drums in Los Angeles in November 1956. There couldn't be a bigger contrast between that very laid-back, very delicate ballad playing and a record that he made in 1961 with members of the Beaux-Arts Quartet and other string players, John Nevis on bass and Roy Haynes on drums. This was an album called Focus, and from it you've chosen a piece called I'm Late, I'm Late. This is almost looking like a broken mirror or a kaleidoscope or something, Dave. It's a very fragmented performance, very fragmented composition.
Yes, it is, and it's the start of Focus. Now, Focus is the thing which Stan wanted to do. I mean, a lot of things he did because he was asked to do or because he was supposed to do another session, but he actually planned to do Focus. He wanted to do it. And he said to Eddie Sauter, the composer-arranger, I want you to write me something for me to play and for you to write that you want to write. And what Eddie Sauter did was to write, as it were, a concerto with the solo part left out, and just give him a lead sheet and let him listen to it a few times and then just play it. It's extraordinary. I mean, you've got to be pretty well close to a genius even to be able to think of it, let alone play it.
I'm Late, the opening movement of Focus, composed by Eddie Sauter and improvised as a solo concerto by Stan.Getz. And that was recorded in New York in 1961. Full details on the Jazz Library website. That's www.bbc.co.uk/radio3/Jazz Library. And that's also the place to write to Dave and me if you think that we've so far omitted anything from the great Stan.Getz canon. I'm sure there will be people who've got favourites even up to this point in 1961, but we're going to press on to a vogue which Stan had a huge amount to do with introducing to the United States, namely Bossa Nova. And Dave, this is the band really that started it all off, with the acoustic guitarist Charlie Byrd and the bassist Keita Betts.
Yes, it was, and it arrived courtesy of the US State Department, who used to send musical tours to other parts of the world as sort of goodwill gestures. And one place that was a favourite place to send them was South America. Keita Betts and Charlie Byrd had been to Brazil and come back with examples of music that they were really very captivated by. Stan.Getz was doing a gig in Washington and met Charlie Byrd. Charlie Byrd says, "Come back to my house, I want to play you some music." Heard it, thought, "This is really nice. I'd really like to play some of these tunes." Just in that sort of way that, that no big deal. They got a session together and they tried to do it and they couldn't. They thought, but it's supposed to be easy, but it wasn't. It was quite difficult. They couldn't get it to work. It just wouldn't sound right. So Charlie Byrd said, "Well, look, leave it with me. I'll get some people and we'll try and sort out a way of making it sound right. And when we've got it, we'll give you a call and you can come and do it." Which he did. And eventually Stan got the call, flew from New York to Washington, went to this church where they had the good acoustics. And Charlie Byrd had assembled this extraordinary band of 2 guitars, bass and 2 drummers, both doing very simple things. And they had the tunes, Stan played them, said, "Oh, that's nice, that's good," and flew back that night to New York, having recorded an entire album, thought no more of it.
Upatu from Jazz Samba, the first Verve collection of the bossa novas played by Stan.Getz and Charlie Byrd, recorded in Washington in February 1962. Full personnel again on the Jazz Library website. And we're going to stay with that label for another incarnation of Stan's regular jazz group. We should say that these bossa nova assemblages were things that sort of took place on a one-off basis from time to time. He was still touring with a regular band, and interestingly, in the mid-1960s, he substituted Gary Burton on vibes for a pianist. I think Gary turned up to play for a week and then ended up staying some very long period of time, almost 2 years, I think. What do you think the effect was, Dave, of having Gary Burton in the lineup?
Well, to begin with, it was apparently, according to Gary, to begin with, it was disaster because he didn't know what to do. And Stan didn't like it, but he couldn't tell me what he didn't like, and I didn't like to play, and he kept on telling me not to play during his solo. And gradually, over the course of that week, he gradually worked out how to do it, at the end of which he expected to be given his money and told to go away. But he wasn't. Get said, right, see you next week. And before he had realised, he'd been there for 2 years. And the sound, of course, of the vibraphone as the rhythm section chordal instrument is magical, but quite different from anything that anybody had imagined.
From an album which wasn't released at the time, but recorded in 1964, Gary Burton on vibes, Gene Cherico bass, Joe Hunt drums and Stan.Getz on tenor. That was from the album Nobody Else But Me, and it's the title track by Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein. That album's still available from Verve. Well, Dave, we moved from the 60s to the 70s and actually into the early 80s. This was a period when I can only describe it as Stan trying to keep pace with fashion in more ways than one.
He told me that he didn't exactly say he was under orders, but he was under a great deal of pressure from record companies, saying, Stan, you've got to get current. Gradually, the accompaniment instruments got louder, and he expected them to balance round him, because that's what jazz quartets do, and they didn't. And it got louder and louder, and he found it difficult to cope with. At one point, he even got to the point of trying to use a contact mic, and he said, once it got to that, I knew that it had to stop, you know. He said, have you ever tried playing the saxophone in boxing gloves? It felt like that. He just didn't feel as though he was in charge of his own music anymore. And he made various albums over the course of the late 70s and into the 80s with the likes of Andy Laverne and Chuck Loeb and people like, you know, young jazz rock musicians, really. And sometimes they worked. I mean, they actually did work, because if they're busy, and he's being busy, but the one thing you do notice is the sound gets sounding coarse because he's blowing too hard. That's all I can think of. But some of the bits did come out sounding quite exciting. And so some people say this is the best period of Stan.Getz, and some people don't. And I'm one of the ones who don't.
Billy High Street Samba, the title track of the MRC album from 1981. Stan.Getz on tenor with Mitchell Foreman keyboards, Chuck Loeb, the composer of the piece, on guitar, Mark Egan bass, Victor Lewis drums, and Bobby Thomas on percussion. And that is slightly hard to find, but I know that copies are still available with a little bit of hunting around. Well, Dave Gelly, my guest, we've almost got to that moment in Jazz Library where we have to sit down and decide if we were going to point somebody at the starting point for a Stan.Getz collection. Where would it be? But in your case, I mean, it seems to me there are pulls in all kinds of directions. You seem to be equally enthusiastic, and certainly in the book this seems to be the case, about almost all the periods up to this one and on from it on the other side.
Yes, but if I were to say where to start, there's something that will really knock your socks off, then I say start with Shine, because tenor saxophone playing never got any better than that, really.
Well, that's from the album West Coast Jazz on Verve, recorded in 1955. The very last years of Stan's life, Dave, were a sort of strange change from the way he'd lived it right the way up until the 1980s, because I think I read somewhere, possibly in your book, that he said he'd never actually made a session entirely sober in his entire life until those last years when the onset of cancer actually made him think again about his lifestyle.
His last recordings, his sound became all the things that had happened to his sound up until then, the increasing amount of breath and air in it. You could write a book about just about his sound and how it changed. All those things seemed to come together beautifully. Once he dropped the rock thing, which meant to say it was so loud that you couldn't hear all the delicacy in the sound, once he got back to playing with the piano, bass and drums, it all came together. In the last few years, when he was well enough to play at his best, he was absolutely at his best.
Now, there's one tune which he began to use on almost all those concerts. Billy Strayhorn's Blood Count seems to come up again and again. Was this something to do with the message behind the piece written by Strayhorn in his last days, or is it something that Stan was just totally fascinated by what the piece had to offer?
It was Jim McNeely, the pianist, that brought it to him. He'd never heard it before. Jim McNeely said, listen, Johnny Hodges says that this is his piece. Nobody else ever tried to play Blood Count apart from Johnny Hodges. And he said, what do you think? And played it for him, and Stan said, I love that, I love it, I'm going to start playing it. And it was only after that the question that it was called Blood Count, and it was written by Billy Strayhorn when he was close to death, that it seemed to have a deeper meaning for Stan, but he played it almost every night.
We're going to finish with it now. This is from an album called Live in Paris on the Dreyfus label, recorded in 1982, with the said Jim McNeely on piano, Mark Johnson bass, Victor Lewis drums, live at the New Morning Club. It's Blood Count by Billy Strayhorn. From my guest, Dave Gelly, and me, Alan Shipton. Goodbye.